So let's kick this thing off. This is going to be an awesome webinar, if you can even call it that. Lead grading, lead scoring. You got to use these words together. You got to use these tactics, these strategies together. A lot of us are probably using them individually or not at all. So don't worry. If you fit into any of those buckets, then this one is for you. And if you go ahead, and this is the part where we get to be interactive. So go ahead and in the chat menu or interface, whatever interface you see in Zoom, go ahead and throw it on there. Are you using scoring right now? Or are you using grading right now? One or the other, just go ahead and throw a whole bunch of stuff in the chat. And what I'll do is I'll be able to use that information for, kind of custom and tailor to everyone. Hey, Kim, good to see you. Kristen, thanks. Okay. Did I shave my beard? Oh, you're so good. Yeah, you called it, man. It was getting hot up here, and Game of Thrones is already out. So yeah, the beard went by the wayside. Maybe it'll come back next winter. We'll see. Hey, new to Pardot, nothing's set up yet. Okay, perfect. We're going to talk about both of those. I see some folks already using grading, so this will be great. Maybe you can even throw out some of the things you're doing when we get to those sections. Both, not sure if they're working. Totally common. We're going to be able to nail that today. So, all right, let's launch into this. Sometimes I begin the whole webinar talking about me, but before we do that, let's talk about what we're going to talk about today so we get you hooked in and ready to go on this schedule. So we're going to first examine the CSI question. If you don't know what CSI is, you're going to know at the end of this, but it's a roadmap we use for marketing automation. How do I know if I'm fully utilizing marketing automation? We're going to talk about that, and there's a particular question specific to lead scoring and grading, and that's like your answer. If you can answer that correctly, you get a point on that scoring system. We'll talk about it. That's going to start us off understanding what are we trying to do here, and then we're going to get into scoring strategies. What's the best practice on scoring? Should I give it 4 points? Should I give it 9? 3 points? Overanalyze it perhaps, and then we're actually getting into the tech of how you build that in Pardot. Once we get all hip on scoring strategies, I'm going to give you a Debbie Downer and talk about the problem of just going solo with just scoring. And you'll see a couple great examples in there. I talk about some of the time in the military and everything. It'll be fun. And then we're going to talk about combining scoring and grading, making those BFFs, the milk and cookies, the Batman and Robin, all that good stuff. And then after introducing the idea of using them both together, we're going to then dive deeper into grading and talk about what does it mean to actually set that up, to know it's working, and then also the tech behind it, because it's a little interesting in terms of the tech and how you make it actually function. And then finally at the end, as you're finishing that lunch and you're getting ready to go back, we're going to talk about the future. It'll be a little bit of fun there, some predictive scoring ties in there. And then finally Q&A for everyone who wants to stay after class and eat some Oreos and cookies. We'll have Oreos and cookies for everyone outside the class. We'll get to Q&A after that. So let's launch in. Introducing some best friends. Hey, this is all about when things are better together. That's my wife, Tina, and I think we're eating lobster. Hey, from New Hampshire, that's what we do up here. So this is all about when you combine two things, they're better together. We're both marketers. We like lobster, and you could call us besties. A little bit about myself, if you haven't already met me, it's probably 10 years now in Pardot. I kind of hate updating that number because it's great that I have that experience, but it also makes me feel old. I don't know who else can relate to that. So the other thing we have here is 2,200. That's how many Pardot implementations Cheshire Impact has done, not even counting projects and work we've done with clients and friends to actually fix their systems afterward or help them get even better at strategy. That's on top of that. So suffice it to say, I just throw that number out there at the beginning so that you understand that all the things we're about to talk about didn't just come out of some magic book or in some laboratory, high in the sky. This is like rolling up the sleeves, getting down in there, what works, what doesn't work with grading and scoring. Finally, 34. Actually, I should update that to 32. I just checked. That's the number of skydives that I've done. And the update on that, because I know some of you are tired of seeing that number not change, just did some training recently, and so that number should be growing within the week. I'm just waiting for blue skies, and I probably should get that number going. But you can stay tuned. Just like the Beard Watchers, stay tuned to see that number increase as we add skydives to the list. All right, speaking of Tina, and when things are best together, there's an order to relationships. And if anyone's ever played that game called The Sims, where you can simulate two people talking to each other, and you can talk about interests, you can joke, you can tickle people. Well, there's a certain order to that chaos, just like there is in life with relationships, right? You don't just walk up to strangers and tickle them in the mall, right? The cops are going to get called. And so it all starts with some small talk. You talk about interests. If that works out, you keep going, and you keep having conversations in The Sims, and eventually you make friendships and sometimes relationships, romantic relationships. But there's an order to that chaos, right? If you jump around, it can get dangerous. Well, and by the same token, we've actually created that same kind of order to the chaos for marketing automation. You don't want to jump from, hey, a couple of people that said we're just getting a setup, we haven't really done anything yet. You don't want to jump from that right into, say, multi-touch attribution. That's not the way to go, right? So there's different things, and you have to do at different points in time. And so we created this thing called the Cheshire Success Index. And honestly, that acronym CSI was just too good to pass up. And so CSI is what it is, and it's a 10-step strategic roadmap. It also has tactics in there too. What features should I use first, second, third, fourth? And some of the challenges we saw is that you get something like marketing automation, you have 80,000 things you can do. I think we looked it up. There's like 82 different menu items in Pardot. That's a lot. And so the question can be, well, which one do I do first, second, third, fourth, fifth, right? Well, you don't just walk up and do tickle, right, on the relationship score. You got to start with certain things like getting to know your buyer and setting up ROI tracking. And so that's what the CSI is. The reason we bring this up is because today's webinar is all about CSI number 7. And what this is particularly, this isn't in the alignment phase, where there's other things we've had happen and there's other parts of the CSI. And by the way, if you haven't done a CSI yet, we do it together. It takes about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and it's conversation, and we get you a score at the end of that. What you have at the end of that is where you're at with marketing automation. So if you're not sure, you have a gut feeling, especially those who've been using it for a while, you're not sure where you're at, you have a number between 0 and 10 that says, hey, I'm a 4 out of 10 in marketing automation. And whether that's good or bad or not, I'm a 4, let's make it a 5, right? So that's where you got. You also have your next step. It tells you, okay, you're at this number, this is your very next step in marketing automation. And when you do it in order, it just makes a snowball effect. It's pretty amazing. So number 7 is all about 2-dimensional lead rating, essentially using grading and scoring inside of Pardot. The question, and everything in Pardot, everything in the CSI has a question, so it's an assessment. The question is, do you separately rate your leads for their activity and their quality? And similar to the question we asked at the very beginning, hey, you're doing scoring, you're doing grading, this is what lines up to that. And what you'll find out later on is that, or throughout this webinar, you'll find out that they're amazing together. I mean, peanut butter sandwich is not bad, right? But it's even better with this glass of milk. But a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, there's a reason kids who won't eat anything eat those, right? There's a reason for that. So that's the question we're trying to solve today. We want you, if the answer eventually is yes, you get a full point on that CSI question, and your score then increases by 1. If you're partial, you get a half credit, or if you're not doing this yet, you're a 0. But that's how the assessment works. We ask questions just like this, and you get that score. So let's try to solve this question today, or at least put you on the path for doing it. Now, hey, let's score. Let's talk about scoring and how we make this thing happen. And the first thing I got to tell you to do is avoid getting stuck in the weeds with sales when doing scoring. I had this happen to me where I remember being in the largest meeting room we had at this company I was working at back in the day, and I'm in a conference room with a bunch of people in marketing, a bunch of sales reps. And at this particular company, I had sales reps and sales managers that did not like me. They actually kind of hated me, or at least exuded that. I mean, imagine that, right? Come on, it's me. But they just, marketing versus sales, they're just very not aligned. And I remember this hour-long meeting where people above my pay grade were sort of haggling out, should this click be 4 points or 8 points or 9 points? It actually doesn't matter. In terms of sales, being in that conversation, they don't actually need to know the different parts that make up the score. And as you're going to find out, scoring is actually a marketing device. When you're using it in that 2-dimensional way that we're going to talk about, it's actually for marketing, because scoring is what you're going to use to be able to trigger that a lead is engaged enough to then go over to sales, right? That's all we're using that in Pardot is we're saying, okay, if the score gets high enough, send them over to sales. It's like a trigger. Now, when they get sent over to sales, we want sales to be able to evaluate the lead. And scoring is actually not going to be the best way for them to evaluate. So suffice it to say, you don't need to get in a conversation with sales about what point values are what. You can simply tell them, you could give them a list, but they tend to sort of like want to dive in and hash that out. So you just essentially, what we like to do is tell them, as the engagement increases, the score does too. And the big actions get big scores and the little actions get little scores. But the higher the number is, the more engaged that lead is with our marketing, right? Something simple like that. It's like, okay, great. Higher the number, the more clicks they're doing. Perfect, fine, I'll take it, right? The second thing is, okay, sales is out of it. What about marketing? Should we get all wrapped up around scoring? No, Robin, don't get wrapped up around scoring. Have you seen these memes? I love it. It's great. Hey, Batman, the click should be 2, not smack, right? What you'll find is that the actual amounts on the score actually aren't that important. It's crazy. It's a webinar about scoring and grading, and I'm telling you the score doesn't really matter that much. At least the amounts don't matter. And the second part to that is the default settings in Pardot are actually really good. They've actually figured it out. So much so that I can literally count the number of times I've had to change a score in an account dramatically on my hands. And it's not very many. And that's only the times that they actually needed to. Sometimes people do it and they definitely don't need to. And one example of the default scoring is this slide right here. And you can see in Pardot, and it's very simple. You're going to your admin, you're going to automation settings, and just scoring settings. It's like very easy to find. Good luck finding that in HubSpot. But in Pardot, it's very easy to find. And here's just a screenshot of some of the different things that are happening automatically behind the scenes in Pardot. That's right. It's like you were born with it. Your account came with scoring built in, already active, already automated, already happening. So when any of these actions happen, your prospects get a score plus or minus based on whatever those numbers are. You can absolutely positively change any and every one of these things. And what's interesting is every single object in Pardot, every single landing page, automation, form, content, URL redirect, every different, the 82 menu options, almost each and every one of those allows you to customize the score that gets added to someone in those areas. So it could be not only these default scoring settings, or we call these global scoring settings, but you can also change it per page that someone visits. You can get really granular, but be careful. Right? Again, I said you don't really need to change these default scoring settings, and you also don't want to go crazy with scoring. And one time we worked with a client who's actually a CRM. This was back before Pardot got acquired. It was another large CRM that was using Pardot. And the challenge they had was that they had people with crazy scores, everywhere from like 40 to 1,800. And it was so, the range was so crazy that sales just didn't even like pay attention to it anymore because it was crazy. It didn't make any sense. Like, how did you get people with 1,800 points that just came to your site? Well, it's because they had added points over here and over there and over there. And they actually paid us like several hours to go in there and look at every single area that can affect the score to like make an audit of what's going on. So avoid getting to that point. You don't need to pay someone or dive in there yourself to be able to figure out what's going on. And are we on mute? No, we're actually not on mute. So if you can't hear, then it may be a sound issue. You can always try logging out, logging back in. Good question though. So back to this. Don't get into that situation. Oh, the attendees are on mute. Yes, attendees are on mute, just because there's a lot of you. And but I will unmute you at the end so you can cheer and clap and give me huzzahs. So avoid getting to that situation of that CRM where they had points everywhere and never made sense because it was unwieldy, by not changing your default scorings too much, like make subtle changes. And I typically stick to global scoring settings in this interface, and I don't actually add points on other areas because it just doesn't really need to happen, and you'll see why in a second. Here is one thing I do typically. change though inside of the global scoring settings, which is the event register. Typically, this is set to 0, and I think oftentimes that's done because if you're using one of the meeting tools or vendors that has an automatic plugin to Pardot, oftentimes you're having them fill out a Pardot form and then automatically registering them in the partner, like the webinar, like Zoom or GoToWebinar or WebEx. So because of that, it's usually 0. But sometimes you need people just registering directly with the meeting app, right? Registering directly with Zoom, like you all did here, actually. Because of that, we actually modify the event register to 50 points because you're not coming into another form or Pardot form, which might already give you points. So we do this to make sure you get those 50 points for registering. And typically, you'll see in the Pardot section, let's see if it shows it back up here. Typically, you get 50 points right here. Form submission, 50 points. That's standard, right? And form handlers submission, 50 points. So that's why if you register for a webinar, it's like doing a form, and that's worth giving you 50 points. Yeah, and actually that's an interesting question, Cynthia. So Pardot, it's I guess it's glass half full, glass empty. If you do change the scoring settings, it changes it retroactively for everyone. So like you can see right here, if I change the event registered right now, it affects 207 prospects. And it'll actually change their grade from, or score, excuse me, from whatever it was to whoever it will be. And that's actually can be a really good thing if you want to go ahead and backtrack and change your scoring settings to fit something. But you're right, it does rescore every existing record. But let's revisit that. Maybe you could prep a question for me for the Q&A section, because I'd love to hear about the context of what you're trying to do there with the rescoring. But you're right, there are some challenges to the rescoring, but in the positive side, if you do make changes, it can just automatically do that for everyone else. All right. Find it a really bad thing. Okay, cool. Well, let's talk about it in the Q&A. It's a great conversation to have. One other thing to get to, ninja level scoring happens with scoring categories. This is a relatively new thing that was added to Pardot scoring, relatively new, because it's been around for a while on this thing. But scoring categories are really cool. Essentially, you can create folders inside of Pardot, and you can actually assign scoring categories to those folders. And then people can get points for accessing anything in those folders, any content, landing pages, anything you put in those folders, and someone touches and accesses, it can increase their score. But a score that's kept separate. So you might have an overall score, but you can have a category score as well. So your overall score might be 402, but you might have a category score for marketing automation, might be 200. Now, this is really cool in the use around if you have like multiple products and you're not sure which product they're most interested in, you can take product A, put that in a folder, everything related to that, all the thought leadership, the content, everything to do with that, really, in your marketing side, in that one folder. And then you can put everything with product B in another folder. And then as people are going around engaging and doing all the things and doing all the research that they do, they're going to automatically increment their score on product A versus product B. You can do that with products. You can do that with interest. People have also done that with buyer signals, right? Are you about to have an audit, or are you about to get acquired, or are you VC, or whatever your use case is? Sometimes people actually put use cases in the categories, and then they go from there. I love it. How do you get here? Scoring categories. This is on the scoring interface. So that same path. It's admin, automation settings, scoring settings. And what this is just it's a screenshot of one of the interfaces. So on that scoring setting, the top section is scoring category, and then you just click on edit or create a scoring category, and then this thing pops up. That's how you get there. Does it change the overall score? Yes, it does. Overall score, and it stays and it also gives the category as well. So it's like you get a twofer, your whole score increments as well as your product score. Great questions, really good questions. All right, here is one of the money slides. If there's 2 slides in here that save yourself hassle, and this is like the real wizardry. This is what I found to be, this is the way to look at scoring as a marketer. Very simple. There is big score and there's little score. So all those things you saw back there in the Pardot default, they all fit into this as well. And it's almost like thank the Pardot gods for creating this in the first place this way, because this is essentially how it operates, and this is the best way to go about the strategy for the scoring. All right, so what we're looking to do, the real goal behind scoring, we mentioned this earlier, is get to a threshold where we can automatically have Pardot send this lead over to sales. Now, oftentimes status quo is someone fills out a form, they automatically go to sales, right? In that case, scoring wasn't really needed in that point. Okay, great, wasn't really needed. We just sent them over to sales, so it's kind of an afterthought. But when you start pulling back a little bit and making people have to do a little more work or engage a little bit more with you, do a little more nurturing maybe, or do a little more research before you send them over to sales, that's going to raise your quality of leads that you send. They're going to be at least more engaged. And so oftentimes what you want to do is set this threshold to, instead of having one form get filled out, 2 forms get filled out. And that's typically the starting point. To go from status quo, which is, hey, I fill out a form, I automatically go over. Oftentimes you want to get people to, I fill out a form, and I fill out a second form, maybe the follow-up form. And each of these forms is like we're offering them valuable content, right? So you're offering valuable content here, valuable content there. What we're saying is don't just go ahead and send everyone that downloads one thing over to sales. That's a little much, because oftentimes what happens is this hot lead goes over to sales and sales is like, this guy's not qualified. This is a horrible lead. Marketing, I hate you. And you have situations like I had at that meeting where sales literally hated marketing. It's because we were sending leads that weren't really ready. They weren't really engaged. They were hard to track down. Yet marketing was saying, these are really important. Call them right away. And sales is like, you guys are full of BS, right? So this is how we avoid that. Now, scoring, we're looking to get a threshold. So oftentimes I suggest you set that threshold to 100 points. What that means is you're creating an automation rule in Pardot that says if the prospect score gets to 100 or more, assign them over to a sales rep in Salesforce, right? That's your trigger to send someone over to Salesforce to the attention of a sales rep, or assign it to a queue, or somehow send it over so that they're going to get assigned to a rep for follow-up, to actual sales rep for follow-up. That's how we could say this is a marketing qualified or pre-qualified lead, is at that 100-point threshold. It's just a little bit better than 50, right? It takes 2 forms to get there. And so the whole reason for having big score versus little score is what we don't want to have happen is, let's say somebody gets an email, they click a bunch of links and they went to a bunch of pages on your website, and then you send them over to sales, right? Well, they didn't really do anything. So the important part with a big score versus little score, if you do something that takes time, like you filled out a form, you have to actually, you had to actually commit some of your information to a form, or you had to do some work, right? When you signed up for this webinar, you were actually committing. You were saying, look, this sounds interesting to me, and I'm going to give you all this stuff. I think we asked you for a few things, not too many, because you might have been like, I don't know if I want to tell you that much information for this webinar, but you did. And so because you registered for something or you filled out a form, that's a commitment, right? And so for that, you give it a big score. But everything else is a little score. So we would not want to give you 50 points for a link click. And the way to think about this is how much time and how much effort did it take the prospect to take that action? If it took little time, we should give them little score. If it took them a little more thought process, okay, the question is my name, here's the answer, the question is this, here's my answer, right? Then it gets a big score, because what we want to do is eventually send someone who's engaged with us twice. Like, let's say we've never met you and you registered for a webinar with us and you attended the webinar, and then you got some other research from us. And you're like, oh, wow, these people are really learning from us. Okay, now it's a great time to send them over to sales so they can reach out. Big score, little score. And so as long as you can change your scoring however you'd like, Batman and Robin, you can make it 4 points, 1.5 points. I don't really care, as long as you keep the concept of big score, little score, so that someone can't just view a bunch of web pages and get assigned to sales, and someone can't, and at the same time, if someone spends energy to register or sign up or attend something, like, hey, you're attending this webinar, there's a lot of you here. That takes effort. You should get a big score for that. And by following this pattern, you're going to be able to have a great threshold, and you're going to be able to trigger off of that without getting too many false negatives in there. Big score, little score. Uh-oh. This is the modern version of the blue screen of death. Back in the day, that was just a bunch of blue background with some crazy text on it. I'm sure I'm triggering people left and right seeing this screen, but don't worry, I have a Mac, so we won't see this particular screen on this webinar. So the reason I bring this thing up is, by the way, some great questions. I'm gonna keep rolling, but then we'll get to some of those at the Q&A. Why scoring alone breaks everything? And to give you a good example of this, let me take you back to 2016. Who is that hard charger right there in the middle? That's me. I've got my tough guy face on. My friend Ben over here, talking about best buds. Ben is a really nice guy, but this is the photo right before we're about to do our first mission in Iraq. So we were putting on our tough guy face, or you call it a war face, in preparation of going out on this night mission. So the reason I bring this thing up is because for a while in Iraq, I was driving a Humvee. But when you drive a Humvee at night, you need to use night vision because we're not just, we have our lights on. You don't drive with your lights on. That's like a target, right? So it's a really weird concept, but you actually turn off all your lights, not even like side lights, nothing. It's completely dark out. There's no more street lights on. And you're driving and it looks something like this. It's a green screen. And it looks like exactly what you see. It looks like a two-dimensional, it looks like this flat picture, like you're playing a video game. And you do not have depth perception because the way that they call them NVGs, night vision goggles, work is that the camera looking forward it has one circle, has one eye, right? It's like one lens of a camera. And then that then feeds to both of your eyes, where you actually in real life, both your eyes provide depth perception, so you can see far, you can see near, if something's like, it's gonna hit me, or no, that's like a mile away, it's not gonna hit me at all. But when you go to this version, you actually can't really tell. You make a smart guess based on what you think, but you actually completely lose your depth perception. Sometimes you're picking up the NVG so you can see with your real eyes to say, is that thing really close or not? I even ran over concertina wire one time. Super embarrassing, but you can't really tell how close or far away things are. This is the same kind of thing of what happens when we don't have lead scoring and grading together. And so to demonstrate this, let's take our NVGs off and let's go to a kid's birthday party. And I don't know if you've ever seen this, but it's hilarious. I have 2 kids and yeah, all the piñatas tend to look like that too. It's so weird. So here's a lead score quiz. This is the first quiz. We're going to do 2 of these. Quiz number 1, see down below, prospect A, prospect B. Who are you going to call first? Prospect A, go ahead, throw it in chat too. Are you going to call prospect A or prospect B? And I know, you're blindfolded. If you've ever seen a kid swing a piñata blindfolded, it's hilarious. And this is what makes this whole event last like 30 minutes because no one can really hit it. And if they can't hit it, they're kind of swinging wildly. And yep, so somebody's saying B. See, we got some smart folks here. Like, why would you say B? Depends who maps to your target. That's another good point. You don't really know. It's almost like a trick question here. You don't really know who to send. But what ends up happening is that when this gets sent over to sales and they can only see score, and we've told them that score means they're more engaged, or they just say that they're better. Sometimes if we're not careful with the words, we're saying, oh, lead score means better. And oftentimes this is what sales has dealt with apps that don't have scoring and grading. Quick aside, something like a Marketo has flames, it has stars, HubSpot, all these other apps. I'm surprised they haven't done this. No one else has scoring and grading. You can hack it, you can make that happen, but they have these other qualities about them, but no one has scoring and grading. And so typically sales you're going to deal with have come from other companies or other experiences where they've been given lead scores in the past and they almost are always horrible. Why? Because you have no idea, and sales knows this, and they hate swinging at piñatas like this and missing all the time. What's the answer? Well, if you said prospect A, and no one did because you all knew it was a trick question, or call both, that's a good answer. But we're gonna get, that can be challenging to call both. Let's say there's a million of them, and call them all. So prospect A from our earlier example, what did he have for a score? He had 820. That's a lot. Think big score, little score, right? Let's say you're doing that appropriate. Let's say you're doing scoring exactly like we talked about. You didn't hack anything. 820 is a great score, right? Sammy's an undergrad at NYU, and he's doing a project with his friends and his classmates. He's doing it on your industry. So he's a big fan. He Google searched, he found your company, and he found that, oh, you have a lot of landing pages and you have a lot of content that he can just print out and look impressive to his professor. So he did that. And guess what? When he downloaded all your content, he looked like an amazing lead if you just use Lead Score, right? It's almost like we're driving in Iraq again with only, one dimension. We can't quite tell what's going on. And, any of you that were thinking maybe B was it in this trick question on this quiz, you were right. In this particular case, prospect B was an exec. It's your ideal buyer. Is exactly who you wanted to talk to was in B. But you know what? Sales called, not just called, but they went after all those A's first. They went after all those high scorers first. Let's say there were 50 of them. They went after all the high scores first. And by the time they got to the low scores, or sometimes they don't even call the low scores, right? But by the time they got to the low scores, somebody else had called them first. And so sometimes you go with the first person that calls you. It's a stat. People go with the first vendor that calls them. Like, I was like 60% of the time. It's crazy. So in the end, it's a fail, right? It's a fail to do that. And just a quick aside, when it comes to sales, I had a great opportunity to do some sales. It's a longer story, but I did some sales at bridal shows. I was selling tuxedos and talking to brides as they walked by at bridal shows, and it was kind of cool because I'm like a marketer, but I got a chance to like be a sales guy for a little bit and talk to people and see what's up and try to get them to sign up. And I quickly realized from this experience that I was trying to convert people. I needed people to fill out my form on my clipboard at these events. If I wasted a lot of time hemming, hawing with someone who was like, nah, I'm not really interested. I could talk to them all day. I could ask them how their day was going. But if they weren't going to sign up at the end of the day, I was actually wasting my time. I was losing money talking to people that weren't a fit. And so this is something that's really important to know. In sales, it's all about prioritizing your time. Where do I spend my time? And so where marketing can really put their foot in their mouth is by telling sales where to prioritize their time and be wrong about it. I'd rather you just not do that at all than be wrong, because you're hurting yourself, you're losing credit with your audience, and sales is in customer, right? You're sending them all these leads, and if you send people and your prioritization is wrong, they're going to ignore it, and they're going to think less of you because of it. So just remember, it's all about prioritizing your time in sales. So what makes everything better? Grading makes everything better. Chocolate too, bacon, beer, coffee. Pick your battles. Quick poll, go ahead and throw, of all these choices, or maybe your own choice, throw it in chat. Which one would you choose? What makes everything better? You can say grading, but don't worry, we'll talk about grading. Is it beer? Is it chocolate? Is it coffee? Or is it bacon? Go ahead and throw it in the chat, and we'll tally it up, and maybe we'll send you some bacon. Kristen, bacon. Christina, coffee. Beer. Nice. Is it Friday yet? Does wine count? Yes, we'll allow that. Chocolate, yeah. Chocolate beer. Well played. Chocolate beer coffee. Oh, and I see, now we're thinking chocolate beer bacon coffee. Okay, before we go crazy, let's keep going. But thanks to everyone for throwing in their ideas there. So here's the deal. Remember those books with Where's Waldo? Huge book, all these different things on it. You're like, look at that. My slide deck is kind of like that. We've got some fun pictures in here. But guess what? This is the slide with Waldo on it. So if there's one slide you took a photo of with your phone, it would be this one. And that's okay. I don't even have the Chess logo in there. What am I doing? That's fine. Actually, it's behind Waldo, I think. But that's okay. This is the slide from the whole deck that really summarizes scoring and grading. If you can understand these concepts and just totally master them, you're going to be able to help train other marketers, in your company if you have more than one, and also training sales and what they're looking at. So this is key. We're going to dive into this thing. Better together. It's the one slide. So let's talk about it together and separate. Let's talk about scoring. Scoring, and this is the best way I've ever heard it described, scoring versus grading. Scoring is how interested they are in you. And grading is how interested you are in them. So one more time, because it's really important. Scoring is how interested they are in you, and grading is how interested you are in them. Think about a mutual relationship, best friends or those romantic relationships from the beginning in The Sims. You could be really interested in someone, But does it help if they're interested in you too? Yeah, it does. You need that mutual interest, right? And so often we've been looking at folks just based on scoring. That's how interested they are in you. But how many times have we had people interested in us? Maybe we're not interested in them, right? It happens in life. It also happens a lot in marketing. We have some people that fill out our content that aren't a good fit at all, right? So scoring, we're tracking activity and we're tracking engagement. This is actions they're taking. And what we're doing is we're saying the more actions they take, that's showing their general level of interest in us. Whereas with grading, we're actually going to separately check them against certain qualities. Do they have this quality? Do they have that quality? So we're not actually going to include activity in this. And this is important later on when we talk about setting up grading. Avoid this slippery slope. Sometimes people go, okay, scoring grading, got it, Casey. But then they go ahead and they put some activity things into their score, into their grade. Did they attend 2 webinars? Grade increase. No. That's not where it goes. If it's an activity, if the question you're asking is an activity and it has to go in scoring, you got to do this. Otherwise, it muddles the water and it's no longer saying how interested you are in them. It's saying a little bit of the both. This is a common thing that people do too. Sometimes they want to combine the grading into the scoring. Don't do that. Pretend there's this huge wall, the Great Wall of China, in between these two. Scoring has a number that increases. Grading has a letter grade, A through F. Finally, scoring is a marketing mechanism. I mean, this is counterintuitive. Beforehand, it was a sales thing, right? And they hated it. But when you have scoring and grading, marketing is typically looking at the engagement. It's looking at that number, right, to hit that threshold. In sales, we want their attention on the grade. And actually, the way I tend to sort it in Salesforce is I'll sort first, let's say you have a bunch of leads in front of you, sort first based on grade, show me all the A's, and then sort based on score. So show me all the A's and then rank them based on their engagement with us. Now, as we know from that previous quiz, that the executive may not be as engaged as some student, but they're a great lead, so we want to go after them. But so first we're going to look at the grade and then the score. So sorting in that order. All right. If you weren't hungry or if you haven't done lunch already, now you're hungry again. Oreos and milk. Can we think of anything that goes better than that? Probably, but I can't think of any at the time. So let's talk about grading and how to actually dive into specifics of setting it up, the mechanisms behind it, and what makes it actually matter. We know they're important. We know what the differences are, but let's sort of dive in deeper into grading. With scoring, it's just based on activities, and we know the activities that are happening. We're controlling them, or they're in marketing. But grading is a little different. In grading, it requires knowing your best buyer, your best lead. Best buyer is a great concept, great book. You can Google that. Best buyer, best lead. Who are your ideal leads, right? Now, this is not a question you should be answering. If you know the answer, great. But this is a question sales should be answering for you. If they're worth their salt, if you will. Sales should be able to tell you the best leads they want to talk to, essentially the most qualified people. Sometimes marketing takes this on because sales gives us a bunch of answers, and we'll talk about what you do in that situation. But really this requires knowing what are the qualities of your best lead. And we're going to get to a concept called BANT next, which is a great way to start. But oftentimes these questions, like you start by asking sales, hey, guys, I was once in a room with a bunch of sales reps and sales managers, and I asked the room, hey, who are your ideal buyers? Who are the people you'd love me to get more of for you to talk to? It's a great way to start that question. And typically the answer you're just going to get are great. Start writing them down like furiously. Now, I will say in that particular meeting, the sales manager started and had this sort of generic, weird answer. And then the sales reps were actually much more on target. And I've also had the opposite happen where the reps were all over the place. Like, I'll call anybody. And the manager's like, well, focus your time on X, Y, and Z. So keep in mind, it's a little bit of an explorative process. You're going into the danger world of sales by asking these questions, but it's worth the conversation. So asking them, who do you want to talk to? And sometimes it's not even things like project or timeline, but it might be things like, well, we work with people in the medical world. Let's say we work with hospitals. And if it's hospitals, the number of beds is really important, right? Or if they're private health versus public health, that matters too. Public health, a lot more beds. Private health, a lot less beds, but sometimes more money. It's different questions, but this is typically a sales conversation. So who do you want more of? And then what you do is you can then take those questions and you build them into grading, which we'll talk about next. Another quick thing to throw out there, BDRs, right, often aren't even in that meeting room. You have the reps, you have the managers, they're all saying what's up. I've had conversations, and we do these like on-sites, right? We'll come on-site to your company, and we sit down with sales, marketing, because you've asked them to do this already, and they've said no. And so bring us in. We sort of facilitate the fun. We bring in beer, by the way, and pizza, because that gets sales. It's sort of, they're attracted by the scent of beer and pizza. So we get them in the room, and what we do is you start asking questions, and I've had sales not know. And at one time had a conversation with people where we said, okay, endpoints, it was their thing. They need to know how many computers you have in your company, how many desktop laptops, that kind of thing, because they're going to help you with licenses. And I was like, well, how many is too many? 100? 50? Like, no, I'll call 50. 10? Okay, 10 must be too low. No, I'll call 10. Well, if they have one computer, you're going to call them? Yeah, sure, I'll call them, right? So they were just going to call everybody. So you could see sometimes sales doesn't necessarily know how to prioritize. Hopefully they do, and then you're golden. But sometimes they don't, in which case we ask the BDRs, hey, who do you talk to? Who do you want to speak to? And more importantly, because they don't usually get to choose in BDR, they just have to call everyone. We ask them, who are the people that call you back? That's the question. Who calls you back? And oftentimes their answers are amazing. Like the whole room's like, wow, glad we invited this guy, because they actually knew. And so they said, oh, well, if I call and I leave a voicemail about this or about this, X, Y, and Z, they always call me back like right away. So like golden. We want to know if people are like that because we can grade them higher. There's a thing called BANT. Who knows about BANT out there? If you've bumped into it, throw it in the chat. BANT is like basic lead grading. It's actually from the sales world. It's like basic sales pre-qualification. There are a lot of sales models out there, just like we have things like ABM, and we have our own strategies out here. Sales have their own. One's called Challenger Sale, Miller Hyman. There's all sorts of different methodologies for sales, and one of the most basic one below even those complicated methodologies is just the idea of BANT. Does the person you're calling have BANT? Do they have budget, authority, need, and timeline? And timeline. And these are some like a sales manager asking a basic sales rep saying, okay, that person you're trying to do a deal with, have you checked to make sure they have the money for this project? Do they know how much it could cost? And is the person you're talking to the right person? Are you actually talking to the decision maker? Or are you talking to someone who just supports them and is just kind of wasting your time? Do they actually have a need for this thing? Or are you just kind of having small talk and just wasting both people's time? And then finally, is there a project identified already? Is there a timeline for this? Do they have a date they're looking to go live with on this? Just some basic questions. But typically, if a lead or a prospect fits BANT, in which case, the sales rep has confirmed they have all of this, it's probably a pretty good deal. Doesn't mean they're going to close it every time, but it means that at least they have the pieces in place. So if sales is a little unsure about what they want to do for grading and who they really want to talk to, BANT is a great starting point. And not everyone wants to tell you if they have a budget. So sometimes these questions are best left for BDRs or for sales, but some of these other ones are easier to ask. And so just like with that CSI assessment, asking questions, grading is all about asking questions, individual questions as well. Do they have time? Do they have a timeline? If yes, great. If no, okay, not so good. And so you're going to need several different questions that stack up on each other. Let's look at that. How this works, and I think this is a better screenshot for those that were asking for how do you get to this particular area. And hey, you have a little screenshot up above. Oh, hey, great question. What's a BDR? Business Development Rep. So some organizations will separate out sales reps from people who do lots more cold calling, right, or warm calling. Sometimes what they'll do is a lead comes in, they'll have, sometimes it could be a more junior rep, blasting those phones, trying to set appointments, almost like appointment setting, and then they'll set an appointment for an actual sales rep. And typically they do that so you get training for the junior salesperson, and you don't have to pay them as much. And then you have the more senior person that actually handles the qualified calls. So that's a BDR. It's also called an SDR in other places. Drift, the chat folks want to call them CDRs for chat development reps. There's all sorts of acronyms, but essentially it's almost like a junior sales rep or discovery sales rep. Great question. So this is how the grading actually works inside of Pardot. You have criteria, individual criteria, and you can see this right here. So it's all based on profiles, which means you can have separate grading profiles based on maybe different products you're selling, or if you have different divisions, or if you have different, anything that would separate out your buyers dramatically. Let's say you have like a sales buyer versus an IT buyer. Those are two way different kind of people. And if you evaluate your IT buyer on criteria that you had for your sales buyer, it's not going to fit. Like, how many sales reps do they have? Well, he's in IT, has 0. So you can see how if you have two different distinct buyer personas, even, we talked about that earlier, if you have two different buyer personas, you might want to have two different buyer profiles. But I would say, even just to start with just a single profile, unless you have distinct separate other things. Otherwise, you can get kind of crazy and complicated fast. So here's an example. You see on here criteria. And by the way, you create these. So you see on this side call out right here, criteria name role, you can write that in there. So because you see budget, timeline, region, department, those aren't all BANT, but some are, right? You can see the T from BANT, you can see the budget from BANT, but not everything. And it could be anything you want. The endpoints we talked about earlier, the hospital beds, it can very much be customized. And what you do is you essentially say how important this particular criteria is. Like, are they in the US and Canada? If so, we can sell to them. If they're not, then it's like cut and dry. So if it's like a nice to have criteria, you can actually, you see this call here, you can give it a little bit of credit. So what this grade adjustment means is how much credit you give that particular criteria. It's a nice thing to have, but by and large, you'll never be using 2/3 and 1/3, because typically you don't even have enough criteria to get a solid score anyways. Important thing to remember, and I know there's a lot of stuff coming at you, but important thing to remember is everyone's grade starts automatically at a D. It's a D by default. This might be certification questions too, just you never know. So it starts at a D and it's invisible. And then if you ever adjust it positive or negative, it actually increments from a D to a C or a D to an F. And so every time they get a question correct, like let's say they got role correct, now you go from a D to a C. If they get budget correct, you go from a C to a B, right? You see how it kind of moves and kind of stacks on each other. So anyone that's like on the phone, I know there's a couple of you on the phone, it can be a little hard to necessarily understand or picture this. So the slides will come in handy afterward. But they need to grow. So you don't just automatically say, well, they fit this criteria and this criteria and this criteria, make them an A. You actually have it on an individual level. If they've ever identified their budget is a yes, give them this credit. If they've ever identified their timelines a yes, give them this credit. And it actually grows their score, grows their grade. So what you may find is that people may be sent over to sales, and if they answer more questions on your forms later, they may have a chance to where their grade actually grows. Just keep that in mind. So by and large, you're not going to change that score, the grade adjustment. You're going to leave that at a 1. But if you had something that was minor, well, if they like the Boston Bruins, that's a little bit better than not. So let's go ahead and give them a little more credit, right? So a good example might be, so we work primarily with companies that are B2B, right? If you're B2C, sometimes it can be a fit because you might have like a high dollar value, like colleges. We do a lot of work with colleges and universities because it's B2C, but it's really kind of like a considered purchase. And so in that case, it really is a little more like B2B. So we might grade that a little separately. That's why we may have a different adjustment. Oh, how can you get the role or budget correct? Where is the setup for that? So in this particular slide, it's super simple. You just give something a name and tell it how much weight it has. You just say things like, you know what, budget, and it's very important. So it's a 1. So what's interesting with Pardot, the next screen has how you actually do it. This is the setup for it. It's like the prestige comes next, right? So this is the setup. We have what criteria and how important is it? And then the next slide is how we actually do it. Right. So yeah, perfect. Yeah, Nicholas, we're gonna ask you a question right now, which is, well, how do we actually do it? So you set the criteria up here in the segmentation, and that's it. You literally put a name to the criteria, and you should probably leave it at 1, give it that full letter grade. And then you go and make an automation rule. And in your automation rule, yes, automation rules can do everything. And one of the things they can do is modify grade. So when you name your automation rules, I typically, any of the ones that modify grade, I'll name it grade hyphen and then what it does. So that if I'm looking at automation rules that add people to drip campaigns or automation rules that email over sales or assign, they're all separate. The grading ones start with grade. And I tag them as well. So in the automation rule is where we actually set up the grading. And it works just like this. If this, then this. So one example we mentioned earlier was, country can be really important for some companies and not for others. So for Treasure Impact, we primarily work with marketers in the United States and Canada. So we have right here a great example. If their country is identified as United States or Canada, note there's a semicolon in there. That's how you separate those things out. Not a comma, semicolon. Also could be a certification question. So what you'll note is it says, if this contains this, then go ahead and down below the selection is change profile criteria. I know, I wish it just said something simple like make grading adjustment, right? Because then we'd all be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But almost every time I have to go, wait, which one is it again? That's right. If you remember back to this page, it's a profile criteria. So that's why on here it says change profile criteria. And default is the profile itself, like you'd have multiple profiles. Region was one of the ones back here, right? We set up, all we did was wrote region and let it full letter score. Region, and then you say either matches or doesn't match, and there's a couple other options, but like very plain and simple, either matches or doesn't. If it matches, and anyone that fits this rule, as you see here on the screen, it's gonna increment their grade, whatever it is, up a letter grade. It's not gonna do anything that don't match. You have to make a separate automation rule for people that don't match. And that's important because sometimes you don't care if they don't match. Other times you do. So I very well would have an automation rule just like this that says, if it doesn't contain United States and Canada, I would say down below, make sure that it doesn't match. And what that'll do is actually subtract a letter grade. And you set up one of these for each of those criteria. And so what you have is no matter what information you get, every time it matches some of these criteria, it's going to increment their letter grade or decrement their letter grade. And this is really important, right? Because if someone's outside of your range or the regions that you sell to, you definitely don't want to send them to sales. So many times the F leads don't need to be sent. So oftentimes in my automation rules where I talk about who gets sent over to sales, I will exclude anyone with an F. I know sometimes sales will call everyone, but we don't need them calling our Fs because sending Fs over to sales, or even Ds for that matter, is often what gets marketing in trouble because like, these leads are horrible. And it's like, I know, but you wanted them. No, we don't even send Ds or Fs. And Cs are fine to send as long as we have a bunch of As and a bunch of Bs too. Okay. Now with those things set up, if we did this quiz all over again, who would you pick? Prospect A or prospect B? Right? From earlier, we had 820 versus 60. Now we have the grade and the score in there. And you can see how that works. Now, again, we would flip that around so we prioritize sales would see all the A's and then the B's and then C's, and then based on their score would be after that. Now that F would not even come through, right? So as a lot of you are saying in the chat, yeah, go with prospect B, right? It's a no-brainer. And for sure, F is never getting through because our reputation in marketing to our end customer in sales is going to increase by never, ever, ever sending Fs over. So it's kind of a cool balance, right? We want to make sure we send a whole bunch of A's over, but we also want to make sure we never send Fs over. So what you can find is on your forms, it becomes just as important to find those A's as it is to weed out the Fs, because middle ground is okay, but those extremes are important to note, and it's important to grade them so we can get those over to sales or not, depending on what their grade is. And just the example in this, if you've ever seen kids hit a piñata with no blindfold, it's like a different sport altogether. It's a different activity altogether. My son just recently had his birthday party at the dojo, and there was the poor karate instructor was holding up the piñata himself. And brave, he was like, oh, it's conditioning. And these kids are all swinging these bats. And I was so proud to watch John wind up and take a swing at this piñata. That's not him, by the way, but that's a cool graphic. It looks just like it. And you know what? Kids were just whacking on this piñata. They're getting some serious hits in there. And you can see it's like a totally different thing. Same thing with the leads, right? You can actually zero in and smack those leads and get them over to sales and close those deals when you don't have those blindfolds on. All right, time to go back to the future. Then we'll wrap it up with some Q&A. A quick caution, if you do any Google searches for things like predictive lead scoring, which we're going to talk about, you're going to find articles. And hey, we're all in marketing, right? So hey, we spot marketing all over the place. But sometimes we don't spot marketing when it's done really well. 3 reasons you should start using predictive lead scoring. Huh, that sounds interesting. Maybe I should check that article out. And then the content was kind of generic, and I was like, okay, yeah, maybe, maybe not. Okay, interesting. And then what does it say at the bottom? Oh, well, hey, you know, buy our thing and you'll be fine. So just a word of caution. The good news is here at Chesh, we're not selling any technology, right? We don't sell technology. We have partners that do, but we don't. So the advice we're going to give you on these things is never like, well, yeah, definitely use this thing or not based on this thing you could buy. Just keep that in mind, right? This can happen. So, shout out to Zoho with their bad content. All right, so let's talk predictive scoring and AI. This is an ever evolving. Yeah, great question. We'll definitely get to that in the Q&A. So this last part, predictive scoring, then we'll get to Q&A. Only have one slide on it. It's a really cool and ever evolving concept, especially the use of AI inside of marketing. And a word of wisdom, right? AI gets abused right now. It's kind of like ABM. People just use it all the time for good and evil. And they're actually not usually talking about artificial intelligence. They're usually talking about augmented intelligence. And the difference is the difference between like the Terminator 2 and maybe, I don't know, using your cell phone, right? So what we're not talking about is unleashing Skynet on your marketing. And it drives me bonkers that both of those words have AI as their acronym, because actually what we're talking about is augmented intelligence. And what that is essentially is you still need a human, but what we're doing is we're using computer learning to help inform the humans better. And there's a couple cautionary tales in that, which is, bad data in, bad data out. And some of those articles like the Zoho one and a few others, hey, you're going to get all these great results. Well, yes, if your data is good. So you do have to mind your data. And on our CSI chart, that roadmap, data is number 2. Getting to know your buyers number 1, data is number 2. You got to nail these things first before you get to the fun stuff later. But I will say there are some helpful indications of where things like predictive scoring can be coming into play. And these have actually been around for a while, but I think now the augmented intelligence is actually catching up to it. And I think the net of it all is that at scale, these can be very helpful. These kind of tools and add-ons can be helpful if you've got multiple geos, you've got multiple products and buyers and personas, and you got a zoo out there. You can use machine learning to start identifying patterns. That's really what we're talking about here with predictive scoring and AI, is what are the patterns that lead to a success? Now, if you don't have scale, you have a very much more straightforward approach, and a lot of people have this, don't even know it. John Deere did some buyer persona research, and they had Adele Ravella come in and do all these buyer interviews with like 30 different buyers. Come to find out, they had 2 buyer personas, right? They're in like all the geos, they're in multiple industries, they're in all these different products and tools, and they had 2 buyer personas. That was it. So we don't have to necessarily make it more complex than it has to be. But that said, I think the predictive scoring really can come into play with the activity patterns. Thinking about activity, scoring and grading. So on the scoring side, on the activity side, it can be hard to discern patterns. And this is where we get into the challenges with multi-touch attribution, right? Anyone that's ever really tried to tackle multi-touch attribution realizes it's kind of hard and kind of gray area. Some people say it's not even possible, right? So, and there's executives in billion-dollar companies who still don't know, and they've had people looking at it for a long time. So it can be hard to identify what activities actually lead to something. Machine learning can help out much better there. Identifying, well, look, if they did this and they did this, these are the most hot things that turns into a sale. If you have enough scale, if you have enough volume, unleashing machine learning on it can be awesome. But I would still say activity patterns are great, but grading is so important, right? You need the milk to make those Oreos good. So the grading patterns should be discovered through actually talking to your buyers, having buyer interviews, and also meeting with sales to find out who are their best buyers. You do those things and you create your grading pattern, and that's really that's your best first start into predicting, if you don't want to talk about predictive, rather than just sort of like unleashing your data on AI and hoping it can sort it out, you actually want to have those conversations with your buyers and have those meetings with sales to understand the input from them first. All right, go time. Have some call to actions for you, and we'll get to Q&A. Couple things to point out. That CSI, we keep talking about, hey, I keep hearing this acronym. If you haven't done a CSI, if you don't know your CSI score, ask someone at Cheshire, whoever your contact is, if you have a contact at sales, if you have a contact at in the operations team, or if you don't have a contact, email me. It's Casey@CheshireImpact.com, and we'll get you that score. It is free. You just need to know, right? This is really important for you to know what your CSI score is. Second, we can take this more in depth. We can actually figure out together your scoring, your grading, hash it out together. We have workshops on this. We can actually get on the phone and really hash it out. So sign up for that. Let's do some follow-up. So it's not just this information, but we actually get it implemented. And like I said, if you have that sales team who's a little cranky, right? We'll bring in the beer and pizza, and we can help align with them so that they're understanding. This is really important. We nail this, and your alignment just shoots to the sky. Other thing, listen to the Hardcore Marketing Show. iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify. Spotify is a great app. It's on there too. So wherever you find your podcast, if you don't do a podcast, start with that one. Had some great guests. Some of the people here today, Kim Gibbons is a great episode. Check that one out. It was amazing. It's all about event marketing and just crushing. So it's amazing stuff. A lot of what I learned is even on these shows. It's amazing, right? I started this thing last year, and I've learned so much since then. So you literally get to learn with me, and probably even better than me at that point. So there's that. And then finally, shoot me a note on Twitter. Let me know what you think. And from there, we will go into Q&A. All right. So we've stopped. Oh, here we go.